Here, along the majestic Hudson River, lies the village of Fort Edward, New York, rich with history and, at one time, one of the largest producers of stoneware in the country. In the days before refrigeration, stoneware and earthenware containers were used to store all manner of household goods and were an important part of society in the 1800s. Examples of pottery and stoneware made in Fort Edward are found in private collections and museums around the country. The first stoneware to be made in Fort Edward was by a man named Otto Lewis. Otto Lewis purchased property on Mill Street in the village in 1857. The building sat near the river and close to the Champlain Canal, where there was already an established complex of buildings producing a variety of products including iron ore, flour, paper, and of course, lumber. The kilns used to produce stoneware needed to burn at extremely high temperatures to properly fire the clay. Stoneware is more durable than earthenware, impervious to moisture, and strong enough to resist scratching with a steel point. At what temperature does clay need to be fired to create stoneware? A. 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, B. 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, or C. 2400 degrees Fahrenheit? The answer is B. Earthenware, like flower pots and urns made by the Hilfinger family, is fired at 1700 degrees. 2400 degrees is necessary to make porcelain. Having two lumber mills nearby ensured easy access to all the fuel Mr. Lewis would need. The clay used to manufacture stoneware was shipped by boat up the Hudson from clay mines in New Jersey and Long Island. Years later, the Hilfinger family would open their own pottery in Fort Edward, and they would use local clay to make their earthenware. Despite being the first in Fort Edward, Otto Lewis's stoneware company didn't last long. Less than a year after starting, Lewis sold his interest to his partner, local merchant George Satterley. Satterley then brought his son-in-law, Andrew Russell, in as partner, and soon the company was using over 400 tons of clay annually to manufacture their wares. When Russell left the firm in 1862 to fight in the Civil War, George Satterley brought in another local merchant as his partner, Michael Morey. Morey would remain a partner in the firm until his death in 1885. Meanwhile, a second pottery was created in 1865 when brothers Jarvis Augustus and Crosby Waring Underwood set up shop close to the Satterley and Morey building on Mill Street. The Underwoods mill produced relatively little stoneware. Just a few years after opening, they sold the business to their brother-in-law, William Ottman, and his partner, Andrew Haxton. Ottman and Haxton had greater success than the Underwoods, and soon, their Hudson River pottery was shipped around the country. The stoneware business was booming in Fort Edward, so in 1872, Andrew Haxton left to build his own mill at the corner of Argyle Street and Broadway. His Fort Edward Stoneware Company was now the third major producer of stoneware in the village, the others being Satterley and Morey and the newly formed Ottman Brothers Pottery. Gilbert and his brother William would continue to manufacture and ship their Ottman Brothers stoneware for another 17 years. In 1875, John Hilfinger, a Civil War veteran and now a pottery painter, moved his wife Margaret and their four sons, Theodore, Rupert, Alexander, and Frederick, into a house at 99 East Street in Fort Edward Village. It's there, in 1884, John and Rupert would open a small earthenware pottery using clay they harvested from a marshy area behind their shop to make vases, urns, and other greenhouseware. John Hilfinger was a well-known painter of pottery and painted his distinctive designs on stoneware for manufacturers throughout the region using the mineral cobalt. Why is so much Fort Edward stoneware decorated in blue cobalt? A. Cobalt was easy to find in Fort Edward. B. It was the color of the local sports team. Or C. Cobalt doesn't burn off during the firing process. The answer is C. Cobalt was not found locally and was usually imported from Eastern Europe. In 1882, George S. Guy and Company took over operation of Andrew Haxton's mill on Argyle Street. By 1883, there were 3 large potteries in Fort Edward, employing over 70 people and using over 2,500 tons of clay annually. In spite of the impressive volume and quality of wares produced in Fort Edward, business at all 3 began to suffer. Machine-made products from Ohio and the availability of less expensive glass and tin containers affected the stoneware market. In order to stay competitive, the three companies established the Fort Edward Stoneware Association. The goal of the association was to reduce expenses by pooling the resources of the three competing companies. In spite of their efforts, the Ottman brothers closed their doors forever in 1889. George Satterley was 70 years old when he retired in 1891. The remaining inventory, molds, tools, and machinery of his Fort Edward Pottery Company were sold at a bankruptcy auction by the county sheriff. Among the buyers at that auction were the Hilfinger brothers. The Hilfingers' little earthenware shop on East Street burned beyond repair in 1892. The house was not damaged by the fire, and it still stands today at 121 East Street. The four Hilfinger brothers then bought the G.S. Guy & Company facility on Argyle Street from George Guy, making them the last manufacturers of ceramics in Fort Edward. They rebuilt the kilns to make them more efficient and used the tools and molds bought at the Satterley auction to begin manufacturing both stoneware and earthenware goods. They called their new company Fort Edward Earthenware Pottery. Theodore Hilfinger, who was not actually a practical potter, soon left the business. The three remaining brothers, Rupert, Alexander, and Frederick, ran the company. At the turn of the century, the Hilfinger brothers modernized their operation. They began using molds and machinery to produce standard flower pots, cuspidors, batter pitchers, drain tile, and sewer pipe. Rupert Hilfinger passed away in 1904. In 1905, Rupert's son Howard started working at the pottery. He was 9 years old. That same year, the two remaining brothers stopped manufacturing stoneware to focus on the mass production of flower pots. In fact, it was Howard and Frederick Hilfinger who invented machines and molds that could press up to 5,000 flower pots per day. Some of their machinery designs were sold to pottery outfits in Canada. The firing process was a long and complex process. The kilns were filled to capacity, sealed with brick for even heating, and monitored day and night to keep a constant temperature. How many flower pots could the Hilfingers burn in one firing? A. 50,000, B. 100,000, or C. 150,000? The answer is C. The inside of the kiln could accommodate a stack up to 20 feet high. Alexander Hilfinger taught pottery courses in Glens Falls, Rutland, and Syracuse until his death in 1932. By 1942, some 50 years after the closing of George Satterley's pottery, the Hilfingers Pottery building needed extensive roof repairs. Frederick, the last remaining brother, and his nephew decided the capital investment was just too much. Frederick and Howard Hilfinger, owners of the last traditional ceramics manufactory in New York State, closed their doors in 1942, bringing an end to the era of pottery made in Fort Edward. The building was razed in 1954. Although the business and the buildings are gone, their legacy lives on. For the latter half of the 19th century, the village of Fort Edward was one of the major centers of stoneware manufacture in the United States. You can still find examples of Fort Edward pottery in private collections and museums around the country. The relatively few pieces that remain are highly prized and are on display at our own Old Fort House Museum in Fort Edward, the New York State Historical Association, the New York State Museum, the Bennington Museum, and even the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. Fort Edward pottery, an important part of the history of Fort Edward, the history of New York State, and the history of the United States.